Now, on a September morning, Guineans woke up and headed to polling stations with one big question before them. Should the military leaders who seized power be allowed to run for president? By the end of the day, ballot boxes told the story because over 90% voted yes. So the new constitution they approved stretches presidential terms from 5 to 7 years, allows 2 re-elections, and even creates a Senate where 1/3 of members are chosen by the president. For some Guineans, it felt like a step towards order, a way to move from military rule into something that looks more like civilian government or in between. But for others, it was a bitter reminder of power being consolidated. So opposition parties had been suspended ahead of the vote, leaving little room for debate. To critics, the result looks less like a democratic choice and more like a carefully designed path for the junta to stay in control. I'm joined by Franklin Nossiter, Sahel Analyst, International Crisis Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Franklin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, Franklin, you've actually, covered Francophone West or even parts of Africa for a long time. How unusual is it that, a post-coup referendum attracts a 90% yes result?
I think it's a trend that we've seen kind of unfolding over the last few years in multiple countries, including, Guinea, Gabon, and then in some of the Sahelian countries as well, where after a military leader takes power, they introduce a new constitution. Maybe they'll have something they call, a national dialogue where they invite people to contribute to that constitution. And then usually the constitution passes pretty overwhelmingly, after a long period of promotion by the government. And I think in French, people will say, well, I'll translate to English, people will say, they don't do all of this to lose, I think was kind of the prevailing sentiment. That being, they don't organize the new constitution, they don't set up this whole process with the intention of losing. And I think that with these kind of very high acceptance rates, despite, deep political divisions that we've known about for years, I think that kind of shows that this maybe was kind of decided from advance.
Okay. Do you have an idea what role local identities, age, and also cohorts and regional divides in Guinea played in shaping how the people voted? Are there any sharp urban-rural splits to watch out for?
In terms of the results, you definitely saw that in Conakry itself, the capital, I think the vote for the yes was something in the low 70%, which is quite high, although it's still less than the rest of the country. And then Guinea does have, some regional divides in its politics, but I don't think you saw those manifested a bit in the turnout and in the results for the referendum, but you didn't see it as much as you might expect, which I think goes to show, that, like I said, the authorities, I think there's a very strong campaign for several months right now to make sure the turnout was high and that people were voting for the yes. We saw that, for example, the government really mobilized the public administration. You saw many government ministers, many of whom were appointed, they come from all over the country, and you saw them for the past few months. They go back to their communities of origin. They talk about the Constitution, about how good it is, and they campaign for the yes. You've seen similar things in the diaspora here in Dakar in Senegal. The Guinean embassy organized an event for the yes. So I don't think it's very surprising to see this kind of overwhelming result in the government's favor with that in mind.
Okay. Now, but does consolidating power in Conakry actually make the region more or less stable? I'm asking if we should expect spillovers, affect the spillover to actually affect from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and even coastal neighbors, during this transition?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It depends on what we think stability is. You cited this Sahel countries, where there's a big problem with the jihad, and you don't have that in Guinea. Not right now. We haven't heard of any jihadist attacks in Guinea, and so I'm not sure that the referendum on the constitution is going to change that situation very much. In terms of political stability, the government who's in charge, you could argue that it makes it more stable. Guinea is now returning to a constitutional order. I think we expect there'll be presidential elections pretty soon. Actually, just today, the Guinean National Assembly, the National Council of the Transition, is meeting to discuss a new electoral code. So in that sense, maybe it'll be a bit more stable with more well-defined rules and things of that nature. But I think when you look at the process that led to this constitution, which was riddled with accusations of favoritism, with problems, you can see that it's really sowing the seeds maybe for future instability. We saw that with the previous president, also had a controversial constitutional referendum in 2020 to amend the constitution, which laid the seeds for his own downfall, the coup the next year. And I think we're seeing something similar here where people generally recognize that this was not an inclusive and credible process. Right now, they're not going to act about it maybe, but down the line, maybe they will.
All right, now, speaking economically now, we know that Guinea is vital for bauxite and other minerals, right? How would foreign investors and mining contracts, react to a constitution that appears to consolidate junta power?
I think that foreign investors are, overall happy to return to something like normality. It's been 4 years now since the coup of General Mamadi Doumbouya. In that time, Guinea has had a charter of the transition, but it hasn't had a constitution. Now, we're returning to kind of normal order. That's what business and investors like. That's what we call a good business climate. So I think, they're probably favorable about this. On the other side, we've seen, that General Doumbouya and his allies, at the top of the government, have not shied away from using arbitrary detention, kidnapping people, and generally, not necessarily following their own rules. And I think that, if that's a trend that continues, that's not something that favorizes, more investment or a good business climate. So I think it all depends, while the constitutional referendum helps return some normality, it all depends on how the government acts after the referendum as well, whether they start respecting their own rules and their own laws, and not kind of acting arbitrarily.
Okay. Now, Franklin, let's talk about, ECOWAS now. How would you expect them and also neighboring capitals to respond if this referendum is presented as the will of the people?
Yeah, I think that we've already seen, ECOWAS in Senegal, where I am, other regional powers, are going to accept this. I think ECOWAS was severely burned after the crisis in Niger in 2023 when there was the coup, and ECOWAS said, maybe we're going to invade, intervene militarily, and then everybody kind of realized that ECOWAS didn't have the capacity to do that. And I don't think ECOWAS is going to make the same mistake again. Especially because Guinea is a country with a port, it has, access to the sea. So, where ECOWAS imposed sanctions in Niger and in Mali that were very economically damaging by closing the borders and things like that, they don't have the power to do that in Guinea because Guinea has this access to the sea. ECOWAS has no real ability to pressure the Guinean authorities to do anything in terms of, inclusivity and respect for democracy. And I think ECOWAS recognizes that and is not, in Niger, they overplayed their hand and they're not going to do that in Guinea. They don't want to risk another departure. In terms of neighboring countries, I think, Senegal is often seen, I'm not just saying this because I live here, but often seen as the big brother of the sub-region, the Senegambia kind of region. And I think the Senegalese authorities prioritize their relationship with the new government much more than they're going to be willing to speak up about, problems with the referendum. So I think everyone is going to kind of accept this and move on.
All right. Now, Frank, the Constitution lengthens the presidential term, to 7 years, right? How does term length affect elite bargains and also factional competition in West African states?
Yeah, the Guinean authorities have argued, that extending the term limits will give greater political stability, that the president needs to refound the country after a period of strife under the previous president, Alpha Conde, and that to do that, you need more time. Maybe that's true. I think it also shows, that obviously they have not announced presidential elections yet. So the General Doumbouya, the current president, that was the one that did the coup against the previous president, is not a candidate officially, but I think many people expect him to run in these presidential elections. And I think by having these 2 7-year terms, they're sending a very strong signal to the world, to Guineans and to the world at large, that General Doumbouya is going to be in power for the time being. And so everybody needs to get used to it. I think that gets back to what I was just saying about Senegal, about ECOWAS. Again, with this 7-year term and with other things, the government is showing, General Doumbouya is in charge. If you want to do business in Guinea, with Guinea, if you want to work with Guinea, you should keep good relations with General Doumbouya. I think that's the main message here.
But do you have an idea if, there are splits within the armed forces that could actually matter in the next 6 months?
Well, in the next 6 months is difficult to know. I am not in the Guinean army, so it's very hard to know that. But there's signs that there are problems. And I think the biggest one is that just last year, actually, General Saliba Coulibaly was a member, actually, of the junta, a member of the group that took over power in 2021, and then was later appointed chief of the defense staff, the highest ranking position in the military. He was found dead. He died in government custody just last year, just last summer. And the authorities themselves said, that he died due to severe psychological trauma and distress. I mean, many people have said, that he was tortured. And there are persistent rumors, I think, that the big difference between General Coulibaly and his former allies was that he did not want General Doumbouya to continue in power. We have no way of knowing this for sure, but that's what people say. And today he's dead. So I think that shows, and that's only one incident among many. There's also, the famous trial of Captain Moussa Dadis Camara, who was the president of Guinea back in 2009, who presided over this horrible massacre in Conakry, was the president at the time, was condemned to prison, and he escaped. There was an escape attempt briefly a couple of years ago. It's still very, and he declined, so it's a long story, but he returned to prison shortly afterwards. But the escape was almost successful, and indeed some of his allies did escape, although they were later recaptured. Many people have said, that there is no way that this escape from this prison, which is right next to the presidential palace, could possibly have happened without support in the military. So, to finish, it's very hard to know from the outside, but it definitely seems like there are divisions.
All right. And let's talk about, the fact that the new constitution creates a Senate with 1/3 presidential appointees. How does that change checks and balances in practice?
I think, in a way it'll make the president more powerful, but I don't think that we should get too, and it certainly means something, especially in a country where many people have criticized the state for spending too much money on state officials. I think creating a whole new category of officials, now senators, that's not going to help that issue. It'll only be more money. And I think more broadly, and this is something that many opposition leaders and civil society figures have said as well, Guinea's problems are not something that's going to be necessarily solved by words on a paper, by this new constitution, by creating a new Senate or something of that nature. The political issues in Guinea and instability go far deeper than that. And we see just that. Alpha Conde, like I said, the former president, we tried to amend the constitution. He amended the constitution in 2020, paving the way for him to run for another term. And he said, this is going to change Guinea's situation. And sure enough, as soon as people weren't happy, some soldiers came in and they changed everything. Creating a new Senate isn't going to fundamentally change that, where soldiers feel that they can just walk in to the president's office, take him prisoner, and do whatever they want.
So let's talk about how, women's political participation will be affected by these constitutional changes. Speak to us on that.
About how women's political participation?
Yes.
Yes. I'm not aware that there are provisions in the Constitution that specifically talk about that. It's possible, but I'm afraid that's not something that I've followed. I think we've mostly been focused on the way this Constitution is paves the way for another term.
Well, that's fine. So let's talk about a risk that this would actually prompt copycat moves elsewhere in the Sahel or even in West Africa. How contagious is this model?
I think that will remain to be seen until the next coup. I think that we've already seen that it's a model that's at least a little bit contagious. We saw in Gabon, not in West Africa, but I think it's a very similar thing. And I think that Guinea is actually, really following the Gabonese model, where you saw, the General Oligui Nguema, overthrew the President Bongo, and then, very quickly he did the constitutional referendum, and now there's presidential elections that he's probably going to win. I think in Guinea, you see that they followed that model. Initially, when they took power, they said they were not going to stay. And then they kind of delayed for a long time. They were saying and doing all sorts of things to make it take longer for elections. But then once they saw that the president in Gabon was able to do this rather quickly and effectively, you saw them follow the same model with quickly doing the constitution, the referendum, and then very soon, certainly, elections. Will it be contagious in other countries? I guess only time will tell.
Okay. Now, just before we go, Franklin, how likely is it, that foreign mercenaries, private security companies, or even external military actors, will be courted by Conakry following this referendum? What are the risks?
I think the risks of that are fairly low. There's the mercenaries and private security contractors are very much in the news these days because of, the Russians and the Sahel and things of that nature. I mean, the big, in Guinea, you don't have the security crisis that you have in the Sahel. At the end of the day, in the Sahel, the Russian private contractors, mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, were brought in to deal with security issues, notably, the jihadist groups. You don't have that situation in Guinea, so there really isn't a need for that. I think that the government in Guinea has shown that they're very capable of, piloting, future elections, piloting this referendum, piloting these future elections, achieving the outcome that they want, and continuing on, without inviting in foreign security contractors who could really, create a domestic political disturbance, and make people react strongly against that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Franklin, for your time and speaking so in-depthly and passionately about this topic. Franklin Nossiter, Sahel Analyst, International Crisis Group. Thank you once again.
Thanks for having me.